All righty. So today, this is going to be following our our behaviors of the last uh, SEVA VentRounds. We did maxim number one, in which we defined what was a breath. And I thought that we would go through the 10 maxims in the next SEVA VentRounds just to strengthen the knowledge of the team and do a little snippet at the beginning, and then we'll on theory, and then we'll do several cases that exemplify uh, the maxim. And we have with us Rob Chatburn and myself as co-hosts of SEVA VentRounds. So the disclosures, we discuss particulars of ventilator modes, no endorsement of any particular mode, manufacturer, or company. Whatever we say, it's our opinion. It does not represent the Cleveland Clinic's. And we receive fees, royalties, and we consult for companies that are here outlined. This is recorded, so just keep your microphone muted for the time being. We may call upon you to comment, and you can use the chat function, and Rob is monitoring that continuously. And again, this is a safe space where we want just to learn, and we actually learn on every single one of these events that we do. And there's a QR code at the end of the session that will take you to the CME environment. And so this is a graph from maxim number two that talks about, maxim number two talks about assistance. And Rob, I'm going to put you on the spot just because I can.
Sure.
Do you want to talk about what maxim number two is about, please?
Yeah, maxim number two is talking about the meaning of an assisted breath. And the word assisted is used in many confusing ways in the literature and by manufacturers. But by assistance, we mean helping, right? And specifically helping with the work of inspiration or the work of breathing. And the way you do that is to perform some work. So assistance is defined as the ventilator performing some portion of the patient's work of breathing, which could be clear up to 100%. Now, what do we mean by work? What does it mean to have the ventilator do work on the patient? Well, in basic physics, work simply means a force acting through a distance. But in physiology terms, it means delivering a volume under pressure. So therefore, we can determine from looking at the pressure, volume, and flow waveforms whether or not the ventilator is doing work on a patient. Now, in this graphic, we see at the top muscle pressure. Now, you will recall that muscle pressure is an imaginary number. It's not something that you measure directly, and certainly not something you see on a ventilator screen. Although something like EDI or esophageal pressure would indicate the presence of muscle pressure. Here we're just showing that we have three breaths, and the muscles are doing active work. They're doing something. They're contracting. Now, in the first breath, we see that volume is being delivered. And you recall from the first maxim, we define the breath as the period of, or inspiration as the period of positive flow. So the bottom curve shows positive flow. We see a rise in volume. And in this case, we also see a rise in ventilator pressure. So we see that volume is being delivered with pressure rising above baseline. The baseline in this case is PEEP. Therefore, by definition, the ventilator is doing work on the patient, and we say that's an assisted breath. That's a definition of an assisted breath. Now look at breath number two. Again, looking at the flow, we know where inspiration is. We see inspiratory flow, we see an inspiratory volume, but look, there's no change in ventilator pressure. That means all of the work is being done by the muscle pressure. So that is by definition an unassisted breath. Now, we rarely see that in the real world. You attach somebody to a ventilator, and rarely does the ventilator control pressure perfectly, as Eduardo has said so many times. And generally what you see is even if a patient is on CPAP, when they breathe in, there'll be a slight drop in pressure, as we see here on the third breath. And when they breathe out, there'll be a slight rise above pressure, above baseline. So this represents patient working on the ventilator on inspiration and during expiration. Now, we can't avoid that. And in fact, we don't really want to, because that little bit of work, the little bit of pressure drop there is what signals the ventilator to trigger inspiration if it's going to be an assisted breath. This is just an example of what we would call a loaded breath. This is CPAP. The ventilator is not providing any assistance. The patient is actually doing work on the ventilator. So that is a brief summary of the idea of assistance and the definitions associated with it.
Great, Rob. Does assistance help uh, define or classify modes of ventilation?
No. Whether or not assistance is being provided is independent of the mode of classification. For example, CPAP can be classified as pressure controlled, continuous spontaneous ventilation, let's say with set point targeting. And yet you can see right here, there's no assistance being provided. That third breath is a patient breathing on CPAP. So is the middle one, except that that's ideal. You never see a zero change in pressure at all during inspiration and expiration. So no, whether or not a breath is assisted is independent of the mode of ventilation. Although most modes of ventilation are designed to assist breath, they are not all in terms of the taxonomy.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob.
Mhm.
Are there any questions on the chat or comments or questions from anybody? Okay. Well, so let's see some examples, and I want you just to, as you're looking at this, we're going to go through the usual SEVA VentRounds, but we'll highlight during this a little bit on which breaths are assisted, which ones are unassisted, and when they are loaded. Okay. So this is a image that we got from Ariel Garnero, who is one of our respiratory therapists. And he actually simulated these waveforms. So there may be some items that you may question, but we can go through them as we go through it. So I will ask online, is there anybody that wants to read or hear? It really doesn't matter if you want to read it or not. And there's a black square in the middle, but I'm covering a little message that he had put, so it really does not need it to be there. So I took it out. So anybody wants to read this?
I can try it, Dr. Mireles. This is Gaurav.
Okay, Garb.
All right, so looking at the waveforms, I think this is, the tag is PC. And I see all mandatory breaths. I know it's a simulated vent, but I see no color change or anything. And the flow and volume waveforms are consistent, are almost identical with every breath, I want to say, except breath 2, where the volume waveform, I don't know, there's negative volume. I don't know how to explain that. So I'll go with PCCMVS for my tag.
Okay.
And for the load, in actually, I mean, it's a square wave, flow waveform. So I'm wondering if this is VC now instead of PC, because they all look identical. So let's go with VC. Can I change it? Sorry.
You want to?
Yeah, sure. Because everything just looks so, similar. It's hard to guess the tag. But the volumes are not changing. Okay. Let's just go with VC for now because it's the square waveform for the flow.
Okay.
And you can see that with VCCMVS. With regards to the load, I want to say it's resistive.
Are you questioning me or you're stating it?
I'm going with a resistive load on inspiration.
Okay.
And expiration too.
Alrighty.
Takes a long time to return to baseline.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't I don't particularly see any PV discordance in the 4 breaths that are here. So normal trigger. Yep. Yep. Exactly. I don't know how to explain the negative volume there on the second breath.
All right. Any comments from anybody else?
Yeah, can I take this one, Eduardo?
Baby, go for it.
Unless you had some tricky way of explaining it, I've given this a lot of thought, and this is
I have an interpretation too. So this is going to be the Clash of the Titans. Let's go for it.
Clash of the Titans. You want to go first?
No, you jumped in.
All right, all right.
And actually, let's see. Is the owner of the truth is Garner Ariel? So go for it. Hit it.
Okay, here's the thing. This is a trick because we have always assumed, and this is in the third maxim that we'll discuss next time, but the ventilators are designed to assume that they are ventilating a single compartment model, which means a single resistance and a single compliance. That's why you see a single pressure, volume, and flow. Right? So if it was a dual compartment model, you'd have to have 2 flows and 2 volumes. Well, we are not looking at a single compartment model. And the way you know that is you have a constant pressure. So that's a constant pressure generator, that's for sure. But it looks like you have a nearly constant flow. So how on earth can you have in a single compartment model constant flow and constant pressure? Well, you can't. So the reason is what you're seeing here is an R and C for the respiratory system in parallel with a resistance to ground. In other words, a leak, a large leak. And you can tell that because if you look at the area on the expiratory curve, it's smaller than the area on the inspiratory curve, even though you can't appreciate it for some reason very well on the volume waveform. But let me show you, if I share my screen, you will be able to.
So let me just go back for a second before you go there. So you're saying what mode it is? PCCMBS?
P, yeah, P like pressure.
Okay, so this is
Yep,
Rob says
Yep.
PCCMB, and then you're saying during that the load is a leak?
You can't determine the load because the flow waveform is being dominated by the leak. So you don't know what's happening. You don't know what the flow is going into the respiratory system. What you're seeing is flow going into a parallel system of an RC and an R. So that flow waveform tells you nothing.
So let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question. Why is the volume the exhaled larger than the volume inhaled?
I'm not sure about that, but you have inhaled and exhaled volume because the RC part is doing that.
The RC part. What do you mean by the RC part?
Well, in order to understand this, you have to be able to visualize this as an electrical circuit. So I'm going to share my screen, and this is what it looks like.
Alrighty.
So this symbol here with a plus and minus, in electrical engineering, that's called a voltage source. In respiratory care, it's called a pressure source. So it's a pressure control. So this resistance is the resistance of the airways. This is the resistance of the respiratory system. And this here is the leak in parallel. So this leak can either, this would be a leak at the level of endotracheal tube, let's say. So what happens is when you switch on, you get flow through here. This fills up, and when it fills up, the flow stops, but then it continues here all continuously. So for as long as the inspiratory time is going, you get a continuous flow of current through here, or in this case, it be flow from the ventilator. And that's why you have a constant flow. So the pathway here gets shut down. It stops as soon as the lungs fill up, but this pathway goes continuously, and that's why you have virtually a continuous flow. And you'll notice that at the beginning, you have flow in both of these pathways. So initially, you have a high flow, it'll spike up, and then you'll have a slow decay down until you get the constant flow. And that's, in fact, exactly what we see, right?
Yep.
I stop sharing. If you look closely, you'll see from your waveform that there's a little peak. See, there's a little peak where you say leak. That's when the capacitor is filling up or the lungs are filling up, and then the rest of that constant flow is the flow going out the leak. And Ariel told me he did this by sticking a leaky HME on the circuit.
Yeah. So the good, excellent, Rob. The trick here of why the tidal volume was bigger when the patient exhaled, and I still don't understand this. Ariel said that the HME was placed before the inspiratory Y. So you would have the ET tube, you would have here the HME, this is inspiration, and then the patient would exhale through here. And so, but that doesn't make much sense to me. Still, the tidal volume should be smaller.
Yeah, without seeing what he actually did, it's hard to say.
Yeah.
But that is a confusing point. You would expect that the exhaled volume would be less than the inhaled volume because it's counting the leak volume, right? Has to be counting the leak volume. I don't know why it's not. It must have something to do with the placement of the flow sensor.
Yes. Sorry for getting late and for interrupting. This is one of my tricky experiments. I think I put the HME before the flow sensor and after the flow sensor, the Y. So my way to explain why the flow doesn't decay is because the machine keeps on providing flow to try to reach the constant pressure. That's the reason. And because the leak is before the Y, the sensor of the G5 senses the flow going inside the vent, but it's not sensing the flow coming out before of the vent. And the part of the expiratory part, there was an increased expiratory resistance. So, and what people said about the tag, keep a look on the level of the pressure and you're going to have the secret. So far, the only thing I can tell that is a pressure control breath composed of mandatory breaths only so far.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, so excellent. So there was I mean, this is very tricky, and I don't expect anybody on the call to find this, but I think that there's another observation that helped us a little bit when we were reading this, and it's actually the pressure. And you may not be able to see it right here, but if you pay attention to the pressure here, to the next pressure, to the next pressure, and to the next pressure, there is actually an increase on the amount of pressure that the ventilator is delivering.
Yeah, you can barely see it. Yeah, you're right. If you draw a straight line, you can see it, right?
And I think it has to do because this ventilator at that time, it didn't have the gain is set too large, the scale. The same for the flow. So you lose some of the ability to see the differences between pressure, but if you now that you know that the pressure is increasing between each one of these breaths, does that change your taxonomy?
Yeah, so the ventilator is automatically increasing the pressure. It'd have to be adaptive because it's not seeing the volume that you have set, whatever that might have been, because of the leak, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a very subtle point. Very good.
Yeah, so this is PCCMB-A on a Hamilton ventilator, and Gaurav, to your point, and you didn't have any PV discordance because there was no patient. There's no evidence of PMOS, so you don't see any of these activities. So and there's no actually the ventilator is being triggered by time because there's none of the usual markers that we have. You remember this triangle of the Hamilton that would tell you that the patient is triggering. So we don't see that. So I think that at the end of the message, just going to the maxing number 2, there is a change in volume and there's a change in pressure. So this is what we would call an assisted breath. Right, Rob?
Correct.
Other comments?
Very good.
All righty. So excellent example. Thank you, Ariel, for making us think until our brains burn. But really interesting. Very good. All right. Okay, here's another one. This is from a live patient without any sabotage. Right? So, is there anybody that wants to read it in the room?
I don't think there's
So,
so this looks like starting with a tag. Looks like pressure. All the breaths are cycled by the machine, by the patient, cycled by the machine. That might be. And I'm gonna have some stats. So with yes,
set point.
set point.
Okay.
As far as the load goes, so inspiratory. Let's say Pima.
Excellent.
And then expiratory. Oh no.
Well, there's
So
no
duration. So when we go to duration, it goes back to normal. It goes back to. Oh, actually, there may be some. Actually, there may be some Pimas too. On the expiratory. The trigger, whenever there's a drop in the pressure correlated with the increase. Let's say trigger is around the same time, so I'm gonna call it normal. And duration, there is some more fitting. When it comes to the cycle, I think the cycle is normal. That's right. So it's the expiration. There's some expiratory.
All right. Thank you very much. Why did you think that there was expiratory work? What made you think that there was expiratory work?
Just the shape of the
curve.
Of the curve, yeah.
All right, expiratory curve. All right. Yeah. So what are those oscillations?
Cardiac oscillation.
Okay, cardiac oscillation. Okay. All righty. So what we have heard is pressure control. And if we look at the pressure, yes, remember the ventilators don't control the pressure very well, but each one of the volumes change a little bit. And this doesn't look like a geometric figure at all. And we have a big sign here that says that it's pressure control, so that helps. So it's pressure control. CMB, and as you said, all of them are triggered by the patient, but triggering by the patient doesn't mean that it's spontaneous. But they're being cycled by the machine. And there's a little hint that this is being cycled by the machine, besides the sign up here, is that if you look at the end expiratory flow, it's a little bit different in each one of them. And that difference in height with the same peak makes us think that this patient that it's timed. So that would go with that. And since I don't see any change on this, and I know the tag for this is set point, meaning that we set the inspiratory pressure and the inspiratory time for the patient. Rob, disagreements?
No, and I think if you were to put a ruler on that, you'd see that the inspiratory times are the same based on the flow waveform. And again, inspiratory time is the start of positive flow to the start of negative flow from maximum number 1.
Yeah. In terms of the load, I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, there's evidence of PMOS on the pressure waveform, and you don't necessarily need to see that, but this tells you that a drop in the inspiratory pressure tells you that there's presence of PMOS most likely, and then you can corroborate that with your waveform that instead of decaying nicely and passively, it has that concavity, and so that tells you that there's PMOS there. And then during exhalation was a little bit tricky. You have two breaths that you can see well, and they kind of decay exponentially, but not perfectly, and they have different peak end expiratory flow. So I would probably agree with you that this looks that there's a degree of PMOS rather than it being completely passive. And I always have a little bit of challenge with these ones because they look kind of passive and perhaps a little bit resistive, but I've been fooled many times because it's just activation of the expiratory muscle. So I like to take a look at that. So I would agree that there's some expiratory work, or I suspect some expiratory work. And then you talked about work shifting during inspiration that goes with that inspiratory PMOS that you saw. You talked about the trigger being on time. Each one of them, even though there's this drop in pressure, it really, the moment that it crosses the flow baseline, it's a flow trigger breath, and it pressurizes as soon as it can. And then the cycle is normal. And actually, this was an interesting one for me, or in the discussion, because you can see the peak that exists up here. So normally this should be a square like that, right? And sometimes our teams may think that this means that there's a late cycle because there's an increase in pressure. But I will highlight time and again that when you're controlling pressure, you always look at the flow. And if you see the flow cross without any stop, so instead of if you would have amplified, if you don't see this meaning like a step up or a step between the inspiration and expiration, then this is unlikely to be a late cycle. I mean, sometimes it could be a matter of gain, but here I don't see any of that. So this is probably just the muscles relaxing rapidly, and that's why you get the increasing pressure because the machine is trying to compensate. Rob, so I would call it normal, just as you did. Roberto, do you disagree?
No, not at all.
Any other comments?
Yeah, it looks like the patient is has some expiratory flow at the time he tries to breathe in as well. So some people would say, well, that's auto PEEP, but specifically auto PEEP happens when you have an expiratory hold in zero flow. You're not actually measuring it. It just indicates that the patient is actively trying to inspire and trigger a breath while he's still exhaling.
I like that. There was another, actually, I remember because we read this one also in Spanish last week. Another thing that made me think that this was expiratory work was the fact that the patient got this amount of inspiratory volume, and then the patient exhaled more than that. And so
yeah, that's a good sign. Yeah.
And so he was just exhaled. I mean, yeah.
How do you differentiate that from a leak?
The leak should actually look
like this,
one over here.
Okay.
But bigger. So you should. I mean, you would expect some
here, and then it comes out. Okay, that's good.
And remember that can be a leak, or it could be just that the patient triggered a breath earlier, right? And so there's a little bit of auto PEEP or air trapping, or not auto PEEP, air trapping during that next breath. But that doesn't mean a common misconception is to think that if you have auto PEEP, that in all the breaths you're going to have that increase, that difference in inspiratory and expiratory. And that just happens at times, not continuously. Then you equilibrate and you can have auto PEEP without that delta. Okay. And your cardiac oscillations, you're absolutely right. So great job. Questions from the team? Any comments on the chat, Rob?
Ariel just mentions that there's expiratory muscle pressure, and I think that's what he's saying, and that we just talked about that.
Okay. Very good. Any other questions from the teams? All right. So if we think about this one, is this breath assisted or not assisted?
Yes.
It is assisted. So even though the patient is doing
some work,
the ventilator is doing a fair amount of work. So this is why work shifting makes sense here. So as the one extreme of the work is all the ventilator doing the work, then the balance moves into where patient is doing all of the work, and actually it can go to a level in which now the patient is doing work on the machine, so loaded. Very good. So here's another example. Is there anybody that wants to read this, Michael? Anybody on the line that wants to read it? Have no fear. Mike, I know that you know. You want to try it again?
Yeah.
All right, we have a double dipper. Okay.
So,
Have no fear.
yeah, let's say this is pressure support. Sorry, pressure control.
Uh-huh.
Pressure control. The triggered by the patient, but still cycled by the EMV. All your
Okay. What is the load?
the load is inspiratory. And expiratory, it looks like it's reduced. The trigger. There's a lot of fortification. Trigger looks. And it's a huge work. That works. I won't call it extreme, but I'm feeling there's work 15 operation. And this cycle, the cycle is normal. And then no normal expiration. And oscillation.
All right. Rob, you want to read this one?
Sure. We're going to ignore the symbol at the top. Again, if we look at the flow waveform, we see that this must be some form of pressure control because you don't see a well-controlled flow waveform with a geometric shape. Furthermore, we see two different peak inspiratory flows. We see two different peak expiratory flows, three different tidal volumes. And if you look close enough, you'll see that the two breaths in the middle that are fairly clear, they have two different inspiratory times.
Okay.
So those two breaths in the middle with two different inspiratory times probably are spontaneous, not mandatory, right? As far as what's the load, very clearly we have distortion in the positive direction for inspiration on inspiratory flow. That can only happen if you have PMUS, and we have a corresponding distortion on the pressure waveform. So basically, the ventilator isn't generating any pressure because the patient's sucking in as fast as the ventilator can go out. We have PMUS. As far as the expiratory load, that looks pretty much exponential on the flow waveform. We see cardiac oscillations. So although it's a fairly long time constant at 1, 2, 3. Could be a little bit of expiratory resistance in there. As far as inspiration, clearly work shifting, cycling. There's no indication that we have early cycling. Probably normal cycling is good. Expiration is fairly normal. So that's the way I would read it. Now, what is the actual targeting scheme, right? And is this CMV or is this CSV? And the only way to figure that out is either look at more breaths or look at what the ventilator says the mode is. So it says VS, that stands for volume support. So that's adaptive, right? And the little double arrows in PRVC, I believe that means it's switching between PRVC and VS. So PRVC on this ventilator indicates mandatory breaths. And again, we have a set tidal volume. So there, again, it indicates that this is adaptive targeting. So if this looks like volume or auto mode, PRVC VS. So if that's true, then you have spontaneous breaths mixed in with mandatory breaths, and it's type 2 IMV, meaning that, as you can see here, there's no mandatory breaths because the spontaneous breaths have suppressed them because the spontaneous rate is faster than the set respiratory rate.
Yeah, the only challenge. So when in this ventilator, and this is the problem with nomenclature, when it's auto mode, it will say auto mode. Here is these little arrows, Rob, just mean backup. So it's just a backup in case that the patient goes on apnea.
Okay.
So I think that your read of PCCSBA is absolutely correct. This part. Very good.
So Eric made a comment. He said, "Can you say that is not a CPAP if you don't have the display name? This is an unusual spontaneous breathing trial on CPAP graph." Yeah, there's an argument there that there's no inspiratory support. Is that because it's on CPAP, or is it simply that the patient is sucking down the pressure in volume support? It's hard to say, right?
Yeah. So in this ventilator, the argument is that the algorithm takes you to 0 when you are consistently above the tidal volume, so continue to drop the pressure until you're at baseline. So I think that that's what you're seeing here.
Right.
That it has taken essentially no support. It pressurizes, but pressurizes to 0.
So Ariel's right. Effectively, it's CPAP at this point, right?
Exactly.
Even though it's not the mode, it's sucked down the support so low that it is effectively CPAP.
Exactly. So it has turned. So and you could essentially imagine that during the part of inspiration, that is this part, the patient is getting no support, and then while the patient is exhaling, the pressure goes up, and that's completely useless because the patient is now exhaling. This is just relaxation of the respiratory muscles or active exhalation. And so you see this peak pressure, and if you're charting or you're thinking how much support is this patient getting, you may think that the patient is getting 4 centimeters of inspiratory pressure, but actually the patient is getting nothing. This is just an artifact.
Oh, it's an artifact.
Yes, this is just the same that we saw on the other one, but it's happening more aggressively because the patient is dropping the from inspiration rapidly to exhalation. So the patient is not getting any support at all. All of this is fake support or anti-support. Right? Any concerns about that, Rob?
That's exactly right. And getting back to our theme, this is not assisted breathing, even though you think it is. It's not.
So it's exactly an unassisted breath. And this is a good example of an unassisted. So assisted, unassisted, assisted, unassisted. Even though the pressure went above, and you can now imagine that if you're doing a trial or a study on or trying to define how much support is the patient getting on, if you don't have know these nuances, you may think that the patient is getting some amount of support, right?
Yeah, if you were to just to look in the chart, you know, someone probably would have recorded that pressure as the inspiratory pressure.
Yeah.
How why is the machine? What is the
Why is that happening?
what is the explanation for this uptick? You know.
So the uptick, you have to, the explanation was very well explained in an article by Magdi Yunus, specifically about this topic, because this is interpreted by many as late cycle. But you can see on the flow that it's crossing the baseline really without any obstruction. And the explanation is that as as you take the breath in and then you start exhaling, the machine was trying to maintain the pressure during inspiration at a certain level. Right. And it's giving flow to maintain that pressure at that level. And then suddenly the respiratory system stops receiving and it's rapidly changing. Actually now it's relaxing the muscles and whatnot. And so because they're their pressure controller is not good enough, then you see this pressure that rises as a manifestation. The machine is trying to drop the flow, but it can't, and you have that rise.
Okay.
So it's an
Also, the
artifact.
PMID. There's the paper that you just mentioned, but from Magni Yunus.
Thank you. Yeah. So it's on the chat for all of those that are interested, but that's exactly what's happening. So it's just an artifact, and it's not pressure that you're getting to the respiratory system to aid the PMOS. Yeah. All right. Okay. Really good. So an unassisted breath. So you can imagine that if I'm walking by this patient, you would say extubate. He's getting appropriate tidal volume with no support, right, and an appropriate respiratory rate on its own. I mean, unless they don't have brain status or whatever. Okay.
Okay.
Anybody wants to read this one? Mike? Mehul? Anybody? Have no fear.
I can give it a try.
All right. Thank you, Garb.
Okay, so we can see that the flow is not constant. So I'd go with PC, and I see a lot of patient triggered breaths, but they're all cycling at the same time. So I would still say they're mandatory breaths. So I'd do CMB. Or maybe it's not PC because the triggered breaths are in the pressure. So let's go with VC CMBS. There's PMAS in inspiration. Expiration, I'll go with elastic. Now coming to discordance. So in the two breaths that you see clearly on the screen, the trigger seems okay, but when the flow is trying to decelerate, the patient is making another effort, it seems like, but I don't see it reflected on the, and you can see it even reflect on the pressure waveform. So I would say that trigger is normal. There's inspiratory work shifting. The cycling may be a little bit early for the patient because the patient seems to want a longer breath. And it's normal expiration. You can see a nice exponential decay in the flow waveform.
Do you agree with that?
Did you say cycle early?
So did you say cycle early or late?
I say cycling early because the patient seems to want a longer breath, but the machine is kind of cycle it off early, and the patient is kind of triggering a breath again. Maybe. So I'll go with early cycle.
All right, so let's talk about this. Lots of good comments, and so you have up here volume control. What we know, and this is the experience that you guys now are gated because you know that many times it says volume control and it's not volume control. So you have to try to read through the waveforms and get an idea of it. And you're used to, if this was volume control, you're used to seeing you would expect if this was a descending ramp to see something that was more geometrical, right? However, do remember that whenever this symbol is there, it sabotages you, and the machine gives you an estimated or simulated curve of what the waveform would look if the sensor was at the Y, kind of like the Hamilton, if you think about that. And so that may be one. There's another marker that tells you that this may be volume control, and it's the fact that you can see that the volume doesn't change between each one of the breaths. And the other one that may help you is the presence of this mega drop on pressure. The patient is on, you can also see a tidal volume here, but it could be an adaptive mode, but those are all things that I think that you're right, Gaurav, this is volume control, CMBS, and the dual mode function is not activated on it. In terms of the load, I actively agree that this is PMOS during inspiration, and during expiration, it seems, I mean, this is a beautiful passive item, and it looks like elastic as you read it. It goes back to baseline relatively fast. The trigger, I agree with it. Even though it's a pressure trigger, you can see the changing color up here. You see the cross of the baseline, and it doesn't take much to start pressurizing. I would rather have it on flow. It would be pressurizing faster, but there's not major delay. But you do see. And so I would call it normal, but right after it triggers and the machine starts pressurizing, and remember at the beginning when it pressurizes, because it's a descending ramp, it gets the majority of the flow, so the pressure starts going up, and then the patient is doing so much effort that it drops the PMA, the pressure below the baseline on this patient. So there's a baseline right there, and it drops it below that. And then the PMOS ends, so it's a very short and intense PMOS, and then the system pressurizes. The ventilator continues delivering flow, and you see this increase in pressure. And so how would we call the cycle? Remember, when you think about cycle, it's all in reference to the patient. So if the breath finishes here, you would want the inspiration to finish right there. That would be normal. But if it ends, the breath ends later, so the breath ends over here and the machine ends later, that's an early cycle. And what you usually see are changes on the pressure waveform going up or on the flow manifesting as we did before. And if it's a early cycle, then you would expect, meaning that the pressure ended earlier, then during exhalation, you would see something like that. You would see the presence of still inspiratory effort, because and you don't see that on this. So if anything, this would be a late cycle. I always have challenges with this, or a little bit of challenges. I think that it's a late cycle, but if I would draw the waveform probably on this patient, it would look something like that, and all of this is the work shifting that is occurring on the patient. So it could be that it's just a deep effort, or it could be that the patient is actually actively exhaling and then he exhales out. But I think that this is late with a normal expiration, and this is all work shifting, as you very well read. And this is a good example again of a breath in which you, if you think about it, you would have during the time that the PMOS is active, the patient is actually now doing effort. It's a loaded breath. And then at the end of the breath, still inspiration from here to here, the patient is getting assistance, right? So it's getting this amount of assistance during, but the PMOS already finished. So still getting some support from the machine, but not when it mattered, not when the patient needed the support. So this is a loaded breath for this patient. Rob, Ariel,
We have a comment. Yeah, we have a comment from Michael. He says a patient triggered breath followed by a subsequent patient effort would indicate an early cycle, or what sometimes is called reverse triggering. But I believe that we've defined an early trigger, wait a minute, an early cycle. This is, as you just said, is a late cycle, not an early cycle. And you can look at the flow waveform. That distortion in the flow waveform is essentially PMUS.
Yep.
You can look at it that way, right?
Yes.
So you see PMUS is relaxing before cycling, so that would be a late cycle, not early cycle, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know if Michael was trying to think of an early trigger.
Yep.
So, but that the early trigger is defined as a machine trigger followed by a patient effort, right?
Yep.
You can never have an early trigger or reverse trigger with a patient trigger breath. And the other thing that Aries points out in the chat is, how do you know this isn't dual targeting? Well, there's two ways you can tell. One, dual targeting happens when you have a constant flow set. So it never happens in a descending ramp flow. That's one thing. And the other thing is, in dual targeting, if the patient makes an inspiratory effort, the flow goes up, not down.
Yeah. Very good. You were going to ask something?
Is there any evidence that the patient is trying to exhale earlier? Like, is there? I'm just not curious why this is early.
Yeah. So
the late cycle. Sorry about that.
Well, so absolutely. So a question that comes is this peak a late cycle? So meaning the patient is actively trying to exhale or relaxed already his muscles, and that's why the pressure went so high, and then the machine relaxes and then exhale.
Okay. Okay.
So you're right there.
Okay.
But that's different than the patient actually bearing down and raising the pressure, if that makes sense. So he the relaxes, and then the what that pressure represents is actually the pressure with the tidal volume inside your lungs, and what you're seeing there.
Yeah, if he was bearing down, it probably wouldn't be such a consistent peak in inspiratory pressure.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It'd be all over the place.
And how are we gonna fix this?
Yeah, how do you fix this?
Next debate.
So everything, remember, goal directed thought here. So if your goal is comfort, this is probably the worst mode for comfort, right? If your goal is tidal volume protection, I mean, he's on 50% on 10 of PIP, then you know the answer too.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
That's why I always try to put into this context is, what is my goal of mechanical ventilation? And after you read all of this, you say, well, my goal is this. Oh, well, he's doing all this stuff. This is wrong, right? Very good. Rob, any other comments?
Nope. That was a good
Alrighty.
session. Difficult. Good session.
Yeah, very, very challenging. Waveforms, excellent reads. Thank you for all of you that read today. As usual, there's the CME for the CCF caregivers, our SEVA webpage, which keeps mutating, but eventually we'll have it established. And thank you very much for everybody and participating, and have a great day.